Talafalava, my name is Léuli Eshrāghi, as is mentioned. I am wearing a blue t-shirt, earrings, and am sitting in a living room. I am tuning in from Nipaluna, or Hobart, in the far south of so-called Australia, on the lands of the Muinina people of this island, Lutruwita, or Tasmania. And I wanted to start particularly with this incredible roundtable to bring us to recognize the kinds of violences in centering a conversation in English, but to particularly platform other languages and the ways that English and other European languages have been wielded as parts of, or part of colonial processes of domination and assimilation. I'm really excited to invite all of the speakers to introduce themselves shortly as well, and maybe situate themselves where they are tuning in from across the lands that we currently know as Canada. Maybe we'll start with Patrick.
Hi, my name is Patrick Cruz. Currently based in Vancouver, where the people of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam First Nations reside. I guess a quick introduction to, are we doing art?
I was thinking we would just quickly state where we are tuning in from, and then we can go into more in-depth chat about each of your practices.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, I'm just here in my apartment here in Vancouver. Yeah, I'm very happy to be part of this gathering, and looking forward to learning from each other. Thanks.
Thank you. Golboo, Amani?
Hi, my name is Golboo, and I'm tuning in from Toronto, otherwise known as Toronto, the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Huron, Wendat, and Petun First Nations, and the Mississaugas of the New Credit. I am a Middle Eastern femme person with short gray hair, and I'm wearing small hoop earrings and a pink sweatshirt, and sitting in my office. Thanks for tuning in, folks.
Thank you. Azza El Siddique?
Hi, my name is Azza El Siddique, and I am joining you all from New Haven, Connecticut. I am on the land of the Mohegan, Mashantucket, Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Scaticook, Golden Hill, Pogawasset, Nihantic, and the Quinnipiac indigenous land.
Thank you. And Tazeen, Qayyum, please.
Hi, everyone, and Assalamu alaikum. My name is Tazeen, and I am right now in my studio in Oakville. And I would like to thank you for including me in this conversation today. It is amazing to be in the company of such wonderful artists. I do want to acknowledge that I am currently in a position of privilege to be sitting here and in the comfort of my studio and talking about my work and my art in such times where so many people have suffered so much during the pandemic and have lost so much. So I feel I'm in a position of privilege today.
Thank you so much. And I think we're going to pass now to Golboo to start us off with a discussion about your practice. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I consider myself a artist working in social practice and performance. A lot of my work has to do with unpacking the site and the performativity and the gestures and the tools of pedagogy, both to examine pedagogy as a tool for transformation, but also as a tool of violence. So a lot of the work that I make involves frameworks that I recognize as being pedagogical frameworks and involving participation in potentially reimagining those frameworks, or at least introducing agency into frameworks that we oftentimes see as being very stable and impermeable. So yeah, kind of my practice in a nutshell.
Thank you so much. And maybe we'll pass on to Patrick to share a few words about your practice as well, and then we'll get into some media discussion.
I guess my practice primarily right now revolves around cooking and painting, and sort of they're very interchangeable, I guess. I've been primarily interested in my own history, and how it sort of relates and how it's entangled with larger conversations, primarily in the experience of being a diasporic artist as well. Most recently, I've been interested in kind of thinking about the impact of colonization in a productive way rather than in a traumatic way, and how does that sort of transmute and transform into a more generative conversation.
Thank you. And if we can pass on to Azza now, thank you.
Hi. So my practice consists of sculpture and installation. I create these like modular sensorial installations that consist of metal frameworks that are usually referenced to architectural plans of ancient Egyptian and Nubian mortuary sites, as well as having elements such as water and unfired clay that begin to dissolve and objects transform, as well as scent, which is used in my practice as material. And within that, I think it was kind of discussed beforehand, this interest in the idea of entropy, and through that, how we also make meaning of the world. And I find that something that's pretty important within my practice and what I'm always searching for is kind of these transcultural exchanges that happen in the ways that we make meaning of the world.
Incredible, thank you. And pass on to Tazeen, please.
So like mentioned, I was born in Pakistan and my native language is Urdu, but I was also raised in Pakistan and under the decaying system of British imperialism and American capitalism, and that informs my diasporic identity in Canada every day. And to break down my practice, I can say that I draw from two distinct concerns or research interests. One is like the outward response to post 9/11 condition of the other. And to do that, I use an image of a cockroach repeatedly in my work, either singular or in multiple numbers, either dead or alive, or you know, to carry the narrative of fear and dehumanization, and how you know, cultures or voices are dismissed that do not fall into the hegemonic you know, narrative. And the second I can say is my text-based work in my practice, which is more based of my inquiry as a female artist, looking you know, towards my personal growth and emotional state of mind. And to do that, I choose words and phrases from Urdu, and I draw them repeatedly for hours at a time, creating these abstract forms and drawings and performances. And these works are spaces where I feel that I'm most vulnerable in, and they stem from a space where you know, I've started questioning a lot of people and a lot of things around me, even my purpose in life. So self-reflexivity has become really an important component of this body of work in my practice. And you know, such concepts are often attributed to meditation and acts of meditation and Sufism, concept of Sufism, which I think not consciously, but have organically come into my practice. And other than an artist, I'm a homemaker, I'm a mother, and I take care of my elderly parents as well. And I think all these inform who I am and what my work is about.
Thank you so much. I think I might start us off with a question for everybody, and take as long as short as you like to respond and go into different tangents. We've got a generous amount of time together. Could you speak about your experiences of working with languages other than English and French in Canada, and if relevant, in an ancestral or third context? And I'll just let somebody turn their mic on and start.
I guess for me, it's been rare actually for me to work in Tagalog, especially outside of art. There was a kind of a leftist magazine that approached me to translate some, you know, some heavy text in Tagalog, but I actually had to refuse because I felt like since English is such an embedded language in Filipino culture, it kind of did the opposite effect, where I'm like, it became kind of what do you call, almost like it generated a kind of weird effect, I guess. I just didn't think it was necessary to turn it into Tagalog. So that was sort of a strange encounter. Yeah. And I noticed too, like a lot of even back home in the Philippines, a lot of the press releases and texts that happen, or a lot of the criticism that happen, is also in English. So I think there's a kind of strange shift. Maybe I don't know. Maybe there will be a kind of revisitation to go back to speaking Tagalog, but maybe because the arena of contemporary art is so westernized that it needed to be standardized in that sense.
Wow, thank you. Thinking a lot about the performativity of, you know, if you are a fluent English speaker and then having another language as this like kind of performance of otherness for Western gaze, wherever that may be, but then you can express yourself perfectly fine in English too. And this, I guess, the opposite of what Sarah Ahmed talks about in terms of strategic essentialisms. But yeah, if anyone else would like to share about your experiences with other languages besides, and I really want to put foreground that it's lowercase o for other, not othered languages.
I'll go ahead. Would you like to? Okay. So I learned, my mother tongue is Farsi, and I learned Farsi as an immigrant in Canada, and with very little ties back to my motherland. And so while it is my mother tongue, it feels like an ancestral language in the sense that I have very rarely been immersed in a culture of Farsi. That being said, it's a language that has been and a culture that has been very carefully curated for me by my parents and my community. And so for a really long time, I really kept my my ethnic or the work that I did in my mother tongue very compartmentalized from my cultural production as an artist. And actually, I began exploring my identity as Iranian diaspora through performance and gesture before I began using language. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that for a very long time, I felt like an outsider, even in my mother tongue. And so there was a lot of insecurity about even being able to communicate in a clear and concise fashion what I was able to communicate in English very easily. So a lot of the work that I've created that is about my Iranian identity or my experience as being diaspora has always been a gesture of either replicating what I have learned or trying to unpack what it means to have the knowledge that I do, while also being very curious and holding very sort of like the potential space for what's been excluded from that learning experience.
So many resonances. Azza, would you like to go in?
Oh, yeah, I was just gonna say, I was like, I don't know how but I'm like, I think there was a mistake that happened. For myself, actually, Arabic, and my family immigrated from Sudan to Canada, and my parents, because we didn't speak any English, my brother and I, so our parents were so excited once we started speaking English, and then they realized that we had lost our Arabic. So my relationship to language, which I think a lot of young immigrants, and what I've noticed within the Sudanese community as well, thinking of the diasporic community and my family friends, their children, and I recently went to go and apprentice with a Sudanese perfumer in Maryland. Her sons, also in the same situation of like immigrating to America, have pretty much lost most of their Arabic too. So there is something within that where I'm like, although I do feel like I ended up in some like panel where it's just like, should I be in here? I think there is something that's really relevant that for children of like the diaspora, this sort of like loss of language, or yeah, and I think that was just something that I have been. It's something that I've come to accept, but I also like. I think I think it may be like a different question, but I've also just been thinking because a lot of my work is also research based, and then I think about, and a lot of it's also like academic journals, and as well as like reading a lot of like mythology and folklore and African folklore, and just like thinking of like the names of the people that are presenting these narratives and so on. There's a lot of questions that are happening there for myself when I think about like language and translation. Yeah, so.
Thank you. I have a lot to say that I will return to after Tazeen.
So yeah, so for me, I think the experiences are ongoing. Like I feel every time I do a work and I present it, there is something new that I discover or learn afterwards. But I would like to speak to a challenge that I face, which an experience and I probably have never shared before in any public space before. And that is, and not necessarily just with my text work, but generally something I experience with my entire, is the, whenever somebody wants to like review my work or write about my work, or, you know, they completely rely on my artist statement. So so you know, so I feel that the burden of explaining my work is completely on my shoulders. But what they don't realize and is that I you know, I struggle with English, right? It's not my first language. Although I'm able to converse in it, I've studied it, and probably I write better than I speak in English. But it is a constant challenge for me. And I, you know, I struggle with finding words to explain myself. I struggle with finding, you know, the right vocabulary. I dread public speaking. So this, you know, so I feel that when this happens, it reflects and it suffers how my work is written about or talked about, and which is very frustrating for me to you know, like 30 years of my practice, and I see this again and again and again. And I suspect that the inability for the viewer or for the writer or for whoever is talking about my work is a scare as well to back, you know, because they're not familiar with the art history or the cultural baggage that I bring, or the language. That they're not able to bring new reading to it or contextualize my work. I mean, they talk about the formal aspects of my work, you know, the didactic division, but they're not able to contextualize it in a way that, or place it in the current contemporary narrative, you know, the landscape. And, you know, and every time I like feel that, you know, where is their voice? It is what I've told them in that piece of writing. And so that's the one challenge that I feel like, you know, it's there. And the other is, of course, you know, because of my, again, the, you know, struggle with English, it's also how my work suffers in translation, especially my text-based work, right? And you know, because I draw words, really meaningful words and poetic words in Urdu and Farsi, but I'm not able to give them the right translation and, you know, how to define them. And also because the words that I chose to draw are not static and they flow in concepts. Whereas as soon as I translate them into English, they become really static and they completely lose the meaning that I want, you know, what is it about. So those are like the challenges that I feel that I'm, other than many other, that I navigate in my practice.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to add, thinking about the variations of language, and I was born and grew up in the settler colony of Australia, and my experience of Persian was like relegated to some of the extended family members in the Baha'i community that I grew up in. So very specific, also very curated experience of the multiplicity of cultures that exists in northern Afghanistan and Iran. and then come under this like, you know, very strange ethno-nationalism from the 60s onwards. So it's this very, and the kind of like strange prejudices that my father, who's Persian from Isfahan, would tell me. And then I was like, I don't know about that. And then I have, you know, in Australia, there's a very large Hazara community. So it's kind of like you get to decolonize some of your inherited biases from your parents' generation, which come from a very specific empire building impulse. That is to say that I don't speak Persian fluently, but I still appreciate being on this panel to moderate with you all. And that I learned Samoan growing up in Samoa as a child. But I first spoke Persian and Samoan before going to school, and then kind of had it beaten out of me by the English compulsory environment. So I think this, and I think it's like always like feeling like, well, particularly with Samoan, I've worked with a lot of Samoan artists and curators and thinkers to create new terms for like installation or expand on an existing term. So it's not just a transliteration from an English term for new reality, but I haven't really sought permission, you know, it's just kind of like, we need to do this. And particularly what you're saying, Tazeen, I was thinking about Cree art historian Richard Hill's reviews in C Magazine a few years ago. He had a column for a while called Close Readings, and particularly looking at these like expansive exhibitions on plains indigenous work, or you know, the prairies indigenous work, but it's always a 101. We're never arriving at in-depth. We're never arriving at literacy in an aesthetic tradition. It's always like, okay, we're, you know, just this first encounter. It's like, I think we've been doing first encounters for 500 years. I'm not really sure if anyone wants to respond to that, or if we can move to another question.
I'd actually love to respond to that because, you know, being someone whose language, whose mother tongue was cultivated in Toronto, Canada, it was not with the understanding and realization that we were being privileged in having the government, who at that time was really pushing a multicultural mandate to support, you know, the money that was coming in through immigration. You know, that we were given access by, you know, being given access to Farsi school on Saturdays, by being given access to certain communities that were funded and certain programs that were funded by the government. All of this was happening while residential schools were enacting genocide and you know, preventing and violating an entire population's language. And to come to realize that as an adult, that these two things sort of existed at the same time, has been, you know, a reckoning for me as an immigrant in this place, but also as someone who didn't choose to come here as diaspora, but also really builds a complex understanding for me of how language is leveraged in a place like Canada, and then the relationship that this colonial politic has with language in general, how language is used as a tool for allowing entry, but also excluding certain groups and communities from participating in culture building and in thriving.
Just processing that. Thank you so much. I feel, yeah, those practices are emulated in all of the English dominant settler colonies around the planet, I think. I thought maybe we could dwell a little bit on our personal lives a tiny bit more. And for those who, I think we've already really touched on this, but thinking about if in different periods of our professional lives as artists and writers and curators and everyone working in the arts, if your experiences of how you might express your language have really changed, or if it's like is it better now, and what is this binary better bad? But yeah, I think particularly the way that like languages, as you're saying, are weaponized by multiculturalist discourse, but then you don't really want to read in Urdu. You just want to eat, biryani. It's like this kind of eating the other, but not really trying to understand and get into the headspace of all of these different diverse intellectual traditions, which are now through diasporic communities also present in the lands called Canada. I might move on to another question then. Are there specific visual and gestural languages as well as verbal and sign? Oh, sorry, Google Tazeen.
Yeah, no, I thought we were going in a sequence, but yeah, no, I would like to answer that question, the first one. And because I think what Azza also pointed out, because I'm like a first generation immigrant, and I have a daughter who's a teenager now and who was born in Canada and grew up in Canada. So yes, so somebody like myself who writes in Urdu poetry and who really loves and lives on Urdu poetry, for my relationship with Urdu has really, I wouldn't say changed, but has amplified when I see that, that my daughter, although she understands Urdu, but is not able, does not communicate in it and is not comfortable using it. And so I just, those are the questions that I ask, like that, how important is it for me? Or is it really important that she has to speak Urdu or she has to learn, that language? And if it is, then why? And, so those are the questions that I think are now pronounced, now that I live here, are more pronounced now. And also, I think my relationship to Urdu has also grown in certain ways is when I go back to Pakistan. And when I see that how over the years, there is such a stark divide in in how in the population of who speaks English versus who speaks Urdu in Pakistan, and it is so disheartening to see that, and the hangover of the the British colonialism, and to the point that I see how there is a decline in Urdu literature in Pakistan. There is a decline in in so much, and how the languages people have started, the younger generation have started looking down upon it in certain ways, and so that really bothers me, and I feel that there is a responsibility that is upon me as well to counter narrative, to counter that and talk about it as well in my work. And yeah, I mean, just like how globalization has really not has completely disproportionate cross-cultural exchange, right? It's never been about an exchange. It's just been taking the Western predominant culture into those into other cultures. And so yeah, so that's what I wanted to say about that.
Yeah, I want to echo that as well. And I think in terms of that question, if it's cemented in Canada, I think I didn't really have necessarily an appreciation to my personal culture when I was growing up. I was actually kind of ashamed of it, and we really looked up to like white culture and Hollywood aesthetics, and sort of trying to emulate that. But moving to Canada, to feel the otherness suddenly, gained some appreciation, and that's the only time that I used to do a lot of freestyle rapping, and it was only here that I tried to learn to freestyle in Tagalog, which was so empowering to do, because no one could understand it other than my people. And I felt like I could say anything without any filter. So yeah, I think it does help to be in a place of displacement sometimes to sort of realize those things.
I like what you said, Patrick, the space of displacement. I like that term.
Totally. There's, I think also, I've discussed with a lot of Indigenous colleagues from across Turtle Island and elsewhere across the Great Ocean about like certain wisdom in diaspora, particularly for colonized or imperially impacted cultures, which is the majority world, to sometimes have better access to neighboring traditions, or even to your like home traditions, because they can thrive in diaspora when they can't thrive at home. So like all of Samoan literature since the 1960s is written in English. And it's like my like life dream to write an essay in Samoan, but I'm like, it's gonna take a long time. I'll start with poetry. But you know, this kind of like, if in my home villages, everyone wants to speak English all the time, and I want to speak Samoan in the diaspora, but I'm on other people's territories, how, like, where do we speak our language? And how is that really, what space is that, and how can we carve that out? And of course, you know, obviously there's a whole lot of field of like social dynamics around linguistics and looking at diasporic communities across Canada and the United States. But it has to be, I think, especially in the arts, it has to be something beyond just the home and like requiring parents to do all of this heavy lifting whilst also trying to adapt to a racist culture. Yeah.
Just to add to that, I think that as youth, as diasporic youth, and like the children of immigrants, there was also a lot of heavy lifting. You know, we were born into the role of language and cultural interpreter in many ways, and not even in like low stakes ways, but in very high stakes ways where we were interpreting for doctors, we were interpreting for teachers, we were interpreting for formal phone calls and interviews, and that responsibility to be this hybrid person that can kind of traverse culture and language, but also like during learning culture and language, I think, you know, speaks to the sort of like very uniquely diasporic experience of interpretation. I think more recently I've been thinking a lot about what it means to interpret, because it's not translation. There's something else that's happening there. And so, you know, thinking about what is happening there, and again, like where interpretation becomes something that's incredibly high stakes, that are, you know, lives and livelihood are attached to, because language does give us access. So a lack of language or misinterpretation has a huge impact.
Absolutely. I was wondering if we can turn a little bit to thinking about the kinds of visual languages and gestural languages that you might be channeling in your practices. And as you're saying, Golboo, perhaps like it's like you're doing it and then you realize that it's a part of a different tradition to the, you know, learning visual arts at OCAD or elsewhere. And particularly thinking about Rajput and other miniature traditions that you're drawing on as well, Tazeen. If any of you would like to share about the kind of learning these visual languages and practicing them at the same time, or gestural languages in performance, and yeah.
So should I go first? Okay. So yeah, I think gestural. I mean, speaking to. I mean, even the text-based work that I do is not, it's not linguistically driven, right? It becomes like a system of science and or mark making that helps me to, you know, investigate how meaning is created and how, you know, and it draws from a range of disciplines, like including art, literature, anthropology, and politics, and spirituality. And so but I think predominantly, I feel, especially in my performance practice, it draws heavily from my cultural, gestural, vocabulary. For example, I mean, just the way when I'm drawing, when I do these live performances, which could last for a couple of hours in a stretch, and I don't take a break in between. But for example, just a small thing like I do not wear my shoes to my drawing space. Now that's something, so embedded in the cultural learning from where I am and where I come from, that you do not, when you are respecting the space or the work that brings livelihood, you do not wear shoes to it. So I cannot imagine doing that, and that's what I do. And even when I'm like, for example, when I'm drawing, the way my body is always like on the floor, bent down. And for me, that posture is the posture of submission, and which comes from prayer. And so that is where I completely have to leave my ego behind, and then I start my work. And so so these are just like few examples, and there, how my body moves during those performances is also, the repetitive gestures. So there are these little minor nuances that, which are embedded in what you were talking about, gestural vocabulary.
Incredible. I'm really thinking about this, like a review in C Magazine, perhaps in a year, of a performance you do soon, but where these resonances, these sophisticated levels of reading are possible, really aiming for an understanding from within and not only from without.
Mm-hmm.
I wondered if anyone else would like to share about gestural or visual languages. We can also move on.
I think I can add on to that, and in terms of that idea of getting a reading from within and without, I think, especially with art criticism, I don't know, I'm not an art critic, so I can't say, but one time I had a review from, I think it was from Momus, about a show I did at Nanaimo Art Gallery, where the writer criticized the work for being not ambitious in terms of not maybe citing references that may not be clear. And specifically, it's a work that I made called Stepmother Tongue, which is a made-up language. And for me, truly, it was about this kind of exorcism of a language that I never even once learned, because it was already erased through colonization. And so it was my attempt to reimagine it. And I had a good chuckle with a critic, because he was sort of trying to find an understanding of these symbols, but the idea is really that you don't get there. And that is the point, is that you don't understand it, whether there's a personal code, whether it's codified or not. The idea is that you experience the language texturally, or energetically. But yeah, it's just funny when this sort of mistranslations happen, and there's this expectation to sort of explain, and if it doesn't match that standard, to this kind of westernized way of unpacking art, especially from the white gaze. I think that was specifically different, because I think it would be different too if the critic was not white. I think there might be a more nuanced sort of understanding. Yeah, I think that was that kind of resonated, this idea of within, an understanding of within and without. Yeah.
Thank you. And I guess also, sorry, go ahead, Azza.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I've always felt that, like, Language has always failed me, especially the English language, which is has now become like my main form of communicating. And so I always think about this quote that Glissant said, that we understand the world better when we tremble with it. And I think about my relationship to visual language, and that's essentially it's it's the language that I use for like the words that I cannot find to express what I want to communicate.
I'd like to share an anecdote, more so to sort of like illustrate how being someone who has learned my language completely removed, or has learned my culture completely removed from an immersive experience, that I have realized that I can't necessarily trust my understanding. Culture and language has come to me via like a broken telephone kind of experience. In this sort of Farsi school that actually my parents initiated as a way to preserve our language and our culture, and invited community to, one of the ways that we learned our heritage was through song and dance. And I distinctly remember one of the dances that we learned to be Kurdish dance. But again, later realizing that what we were actually doing was culturally appropriating a folkloric practice that no one in that education system really identified with. And it wasn't until I was an adult and I met an ustad of Kurdish folkloric dance that I realized that our gestures were this very crude, 5 times removed kind of gesture that was, for the communities that were taking so much joy, which were our parents and our grandparents, in watching us do this. It wasn't a matter of accuracy, or it wasn't a matter of recreating something in a concise way. It was more so this like hinting to something that felt familiar in a sensorial experience of song and dance and energy. But it also felt incredibly problematic as an adult to begin to realize that we were culturally appropriating the diverse ethnicity that exists in a region that we didn't necessarily identify with, and then how to begin to unpack what we felt for so long was part of our culture, because it was presented to us as such, and then how to reconcile and respond to that as at a point where there is more understanding, but really coming to terms with the fact that this curation is not a flawless curation, and that it by itself needs to be unpacked in many ways.
Thank you so much. That's really generous of you to share as well. I think we may all have resonant experiences to share. I wonder as well about, I think, this was particularly for the Iranian Afghanistan context, a subjugation of all of the indigenous peoples and minorities by the majority ethnicity, which doesn't really translate when you're racialized in a Canadian or US or Australian context, because you're suddenly the brown person and you're just a blanket brown person in so many different contexts. Whereas in your home or ancestral home context, you may be the oppressor. And that took me a long time to realize. I was like, oh, okay, so we're only the Persian ethnicity. Oh, we're the bad guys. But this kind of like I learned Māori haka as a child, which is definitely not Samoan culture, but it's this kind of I think they did what they could in the 90s, and there was a lot of wrong in there. And I'm laughing in it because I think we have the benefit of hindsight to look back at these decisions and bring a critical gaze. I wonder if we can quickly talk about the titling of your works. I'm really interested that a majority of you, from what I can see, title your works in English, and yet the content of these works might be, or you are evidently drawing on complex intersectional experiences that you have, as well as the languages, visual, verbal, and otherwise, that you speak and or have a relationship with. Yeah, and I guess if you might want to share about if this is a conscious negotiation, or are you looking towards legibility for like kind of mainstream Canadian or US readership and public? Or if it's something that you haven't really thought about at all. I title a lot of my works in Sāmoan, so that's a kind of vested interest here.
I titled my drawings in Urdu because, and the title is the word that I'm drawing. So that becomes the title of my work as well. But yes, I do, next to the title, I do in brackets write the English translation. And every time I do that, I feel I'm being dishonest because the translation never justifies what the title holds or the word means. But yes, I mean, I guess being again, being an immigrant and first generation immigrant, it is most definitely a conscious effort on my part to get validated, right? To get validated as an artist here. And I do feel that it is because of that that I do this. And I guess there is this, I mean, needless to say, there is societal bias and conditioning that we are born into and we grow up with, and it comes out one way or the other, no matter how much we argue it. And I mean, seminal, works like Edward Said's work on culture and imperialism, they've spotlighted this again and again, that how, even in post-colonial era, these biases exist and are a reality. And I guess we just become part of that too. But I guess, one thing, I mean, these are questions that, all cultural institutions should be talking about and raising. And I think, galleries and museums, for example, should add, for example, like non-English, non-French text when showing the work of, artists of color. And I've, some countries I've noticed have started doing that because, like, for example, the national show at the Gallery of New South Wales in Sydney recently, in when exhibiting the work of a Pakistani artist, Abdullah Syed, they put his artist statement in Urdu. So kind of, recognizing his identity other than his Australian identity. And I think, I think things like that become important.
Absolutely. I attended the Asia Pacific Triennial last week in Mianjin, Brisbane, and a whole lot of the artists' like wall didactic panels were in their ancestral language as well as in English, which I can pinpoint that kind of awakening for myself in Heather Igloli-Ortiz show Decolonize Me at the Ottawa Art Gallery in 2013, as like this kind of like pin whatever moment where you're like, oh, okay, this is possible. And I think definitely can be aspirational. We may not necessarily be fluent in that language, but the point is to show that there are knowledges that interpret this work that is beyond what the majority audience has access to, which kind of leads into thinking about translatability. And you were talking, Patrick, before about, specifically constituting a visual language that that doesn't, you know, it hasn't existed before, you create it, and you're kind of playing with this like, what do you speak in the Philippines? Oh my God, don't you know? We were colonized by Spain for so many centuries, then by the US, and still in this imperial kind of juggernaut system. It's like very, yeah, I was just wondering if you, if it is interesting for all of you to think about translatability and purposely not translating, which I guess leads on from the titling.
Actually, the most recent work I made that's on right now at the VAG is titled in Tagalog and without translation of English. And I've been asked multiple times why there was no translation. And I specifically told them they need to bring a Filipino friend to translate it for them. And if they don't have one, they gotta make friends. But it was it was funny because when I first titled a show in Tagalog back in 2015, I think, or 14 at Center A, I don't know what inspired me to start using my language as titling, but I also used the bracket like Tazeen was talking about, but that bracket for me, I felt like I had to mirror what the bracket was. So it was still a conscious decision of making it one-to-one. But then I realized when it wasn't one-to-one anymore, what does that mean, right? When it's not translating. So there's this kind of discrepancy. So in my most recent project, I decided to just completely take out English and sort of just leave it to that. And I think there's a nice kind of resistance and a kind of powerful gesture when it's impenetrable, when there's this knowledge that, you know, you just have to be okay that you can't access it. I mean, you know, as you know, living as a marginalized body or voice, we're kind of used to that of not being able to access things. So it might be nice to sort of mirror that, you know, once in a while.
I really appreciate that gesture, Patrick. Yeah, I was, for my titling, it's in English, but it does come from like I feel like Golboo, you spoke about it, of like kind of like the interpretation of like the language of like the words and what they mean. So some of my titles come from that, my interpretation of my understanding of like what those words mean in Arabic, and other ones come from kind of remixed and reworked proverbs, like Sudanese proverbs.
I've titled my work in English mainly because English is my dominant language. And so there are moments where my Farsi is not to the degree where I can eloquently express the kind of like complexity of, you know, what I'm trying to do with the work that I've created. That being said, I've made work entirely in Farsi, but it's a recitation. It's something that I'm sort of performing, something that I've practiced. It's not, and even then there is an accent to the language that indicates me as an outsider of that language. And in many ways, that is the language that I speak. And so keeping to that language felt like I was speaking to the people that also speak that language, which is this funny something in between, you know, partially made up, but also very clearly not the authentic thing, not the authentic language, that I think just resonated with folks who have that relationship to their ancestral language.
Has everyone had a chance to answer? Did you speak already on this, Tazeen? And just for the audience, if you can prepare some questions, we are going to be opening up to your questions imminently. And might even ask Alice if you have a question prepared.
Yeah, I think I can get the ball rolling with the questions. It's such an interesting talk. I have so many notes, and it's hard to distinguish one point from the other because I feel like they're all so related. And maybe I'll start with a question that's a bit related to my practice. So in addition to being the associate editor here at Magazine, I also have my own independent writing practice and my own independent curatorial practice. And, you know, I was born and raised in the northern Ecuadorian Andes, and then I moved to Canada and did a lot of my schooling here. And a lot of the work that I do, whether it's writing or curatorial work, is really done across borders. It's done cross-culturally, especially across Indigenous communities that I do. And I've had a lot of issues in the past trying to advocate for things like didactic panels or public like catalogs of my exhibitions to get published in other words other than French and English. And I think it's less of an issue now, but you know, I remember doing independent curatorial work for really big institutions and asking, well, can we get this and this and this language because the person talking is talking about this context? And they said, no, you know, our only funding covers English and maybe French, especially if it's a federal grant here in Canada. It is changing somewhat, but I'm still coming upon barriers, especially in terms of writing grants for non-English and non-French languages here in Canada. And I'm wondering, in your artistic practices, and maybe Léuli as well as a practice researcher, writer, curator, how you deal with these barriers, especially in how kind of colonial granting systems are set up.
I say go with the flow. I'm kidding. I think that's quite interesting, actually, because the system is rooted in that kind of colonial framework, and the language you're using is a colonial framework. Perhaps you could even argue the concept of modern art is a colonial framework. So, all these tools that we're kind of playing with are part of that hegemonic structure. And for me, I try to be sort of, I guess, I try to add humor in the way I sort of approach it. And because also maybe from my training in clown school, that allowed me to sort of see those oppressive forces as, potential points to sort of work with. But there's actually this good essay by Olu Ogibe, Double Dutch in the Culture Game, and how it's always a double-edged sword being a person of color working within this culture game, because you kind of either have to perform yourself or adopt a kind of standard of making and talking. but both ways still is still stacked against you. So I don't know. I think for me, that's why codifying is so important, because it's a way to sort of camouflage and kind of empower yourself to adopt those strategies. For example, I also founded a triennial in the Philippines, and even using the word triennial for me was a way to sort of steal that loaded word, you know, what a triennial means, but actually it's just a barbecue in the backyard. And eventually we got funding from Canada, which I know is blood money, but you know, might as well spread the wealth back home and create, you know, maybe other conversations that might not happen in Canada. So I think, I don't know, it's like, I just see it as like it's never neutral anyway. So might as well make it the most productive sort of transaction. Maybe there will be a sort of an absolute at some point, maybe when everyone's hybridized. I doubt that will happen. I don't know. That's just my thoughts on that.
Yeah, I echo what Patrick is pointing out, and when he says that it's a tricky path to walk, like a double-sided. Like, I mean, if I talk about myself, my practice is also deeply rooted in my learning of a traditional art form, like miniature painting of South Asia and Persian, tradition, and I draw a lot from that tradition. Yet, when I'm doing that work here, I'm also very conscious that how would I be pigeonholed? Will whatever I do would be seen through the lens of Orientalism or aesthetic theory or primitiveness and all those concepts, and I do not want that, right? And I do not want. So it's tricky that, and especially artists like myself who how their work is seen. From the Middle East or the South Asian background, and kind of seen through this term of Islamic art, which again is a problematic term for me to dissect, and that could be another forum altogether, talking about terminologies of definitions of how our work is seen. So yeah, so for me it's extremely tricky that am I the tokenistic artist who fits that narrative of is that how my work could be seen? And although I'm drawing from that tradition as well, so it's challenging. It's like a navigation, a very challenging navigation while we work.
Yeah. Unless there's someone else who wanted to tackle that question, I wanted to move on to this wonderful question in the chat. Okay, I think I'll move on. This wonderful question by Alice Jim. Hi, Alice. Thank you for joining. So Alice is asking, could you comment a bit on how code switching might actually come into your practice? And then in parentheses, language alternation that happens when a speaker alternates between two or more languages or language varieties in the context of a single conversation or situation. I ask because I'm wondering if what people say is the visual translation is not actually the same as linguistic language games or even strategic use of language, thinking about what Patrick is saying about hegemonic forms of communication.
I might start us off with thinking about there are two registers of language in Sāmoan language, and one is a chiefly formal variety that most people can understand but do not master. And I had arguments with my partner about an essay, in terms of our criticism, if it is going to quote terms in Samoan, they have to be written in that register, which is a different vocabulary. And it's like, well, that's not how you speak every day. And it's like, yeah, but this is the standard of text. and you do have to represent the stratification of society and the honorifics in an English or French text if you're going to be quoting from this culture. So I think a lot about that's not like, you know, that's written, but it's like a written code switch, or like having a term that has a specific meaning for a particular community, but then it also might mean something else. And it might be the same English term, like the term country for First Nations of Australia is a very specific term for territory. But most people will just read it and think it means country. But it doesn't have all of the spiritual and political implications.
I think to comment on that too with code switching, I think of, for example, in my painting practice, I like to think of it as how to paint in the wrong way. You know, how does a brown person paint? When I went to grad school, I kept being accused of citing 20th century modernism, and I was not interested in that at all. Like, I was actually interested in craft and things that are, not considered high art in their regard. But so I think for me, code switching is a way to sort of sample things that are wrong, or problematizing symbols that might be mistakenly recognized or misrecognized, and actually like that sort of encounter when it kind of becomes defamiliarized and creates a new sort of generative interpretation. Because I feel like in the kind of Western canon, there's a sense of like this expert, right? The idea of the expert, and I actually prefer the amateur more. There's more sort of possibility to disentangle from that.
I think as people of diaspora, like code switching is our language, because we are pulling from so many different sources of language, or even dominant phrases or sayings from languages that we don't even know, but that have somehow sort of entered our language. And I think that at least I cannot separate my communication from code switching. The only way I'm able to enter the space of my heritage, culture, ethnicity, family is through code switching. And so I think that in many ways, we are able, being in this in-between space of language, that there are things that we pick up on. For example, for a while, I became very interested in this word padiya in Farsi, which refers to fairies in the kind of fairy tales of Iranian poetry and mythology and storytelling. And there are always these sort of like mischievous outsiders, magical creatures, and so on, that bring gifts and sort of make magical things happen. And that reminded me very much of the English word pariah, and really thinking about what some of the relationships might be between these two terms that are only connected, in my mind, cross-lingually because of the language relationships that I have. I don't know that this connection would necessarily be made in another language, but it really set me off on a journey to think about these two words as being related to each other, and what that may mean in terms of like how I interpret these concepts and these characters or these entities in my perception of the world. So I think that cross-contamination is very fertile ground, and being able to code switch is what gives us access to that terrain, which I find very fruitful and actually really new terrain for me at least, to sort of like begin to explore my relationship to language and what that brings up as a unique circumstance.
I think if there's no one else, I think we're a little bit over time. That, you know, maybe that's a good place to close. Does anyone want to say anything else before we close? Maybe think
Thank you
about
for
it.
having
I
us.
wanted to add one quick thing, and that's you know, I learned English about 15 years ago, and I feel like for most of that I was learning English, and I feel like now I'm unlearning English, if that makes sense. A lot of that I think comes from starting to teach. So I also teach at OCAD University, and before I started teaching, you know, I TA'd, and before that I worked at the writing center at the university, where you get trained in teaching. We used to say English as a second language, and now we say English language learners. If you work within the kind of, you know, university writing community, that's the word we use for it now. And you know, I remember being trained and being told we're all English language learners, because we're coming into this academic or artistic context where you have to learn, you know, we say like art English or academic English, and so much of that is not only cultural but also has to do with class. So I think about that a lot now that I'm teaching, but as I teach, I also try to talk about unlearning English and unlearning, you know, the ideas that we have to talk and using specific vocabulary or using a specific tone, and I think that also relates to code switching so much as well, even just within one language, let alone cross-culturally or within multiple languages. So thank you so much, Alice, for such a great question. Is there anything else? I don't know if Google, you wanted to say anything else? Patrick?
I just want to add that it's unfortunate that we have such limited time, but I think this is such a powerful conversation, and I kind of wish that this was a whole symposium. Maybe, you know, this really inspires me actually to sort of even maybe organize in our own sort of place to have these conversations. I think it's really important, and I think it really clarifies the complexity of this process. Yeah, so I thank you all for putting this together.
I thought I'd. Oh, sorry, Tazeen, go.
No, I just wanted to add on to what Patrick is saying, that, you know, this was a great learning experience for me as well, to hear in all the voices, and yeah, I mean, there is so much to unpack. There is so much that's not said yet, and, you know, I guess we're all full up till here, and to you know, to add on. So hopefully another forum, another symposium. Yeah, and thank you for including me into this one.
I think I'd add the, you know, in recognition of Alice Mingwei Jim's incredible work at the Global Asia Pacific Art Exchange, and this ongoing conference organized out of the NYU Asia Pacific American Center Institute, which has so many conversations around art and language and translation, untranslatability, and you know, our vested experiences of code switching. I also wanted to just add a reference of Yamaji curator Stephen Gilchrist, who wrote an essay which inspired me to do a PhD in 2013 called Indigenizing Curatorial Practice, where he said, like, we really need to stop just reading all the same French you know, theorists in translation, and draw on the languages, like the actual terms and concepts from all of our aesthetic traditions, to like renew art criticism and art history in English and in French and in other dominant languages. That you can't really just say, oh, it's a painting from this region. It's like, but it's doing so many other things. And those terms are so much more appropriate than this like endless 101. But yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.